Let me tell you a story. Dr. Aries Thorne had spent his career studying the architecture of consequence. His lab, a sterile suite of humming PET and fMRI machines, was a place where he mapped the brain's response to fairness, punishment, and reward. He'd published the seminal paper on the dorsal striatum, the brain's reward center. You see, when people sacrificed their own money to punish someone who had cheated them, that tiny region of the brain, the one that processes reward, would light up like a firework. Aries called it the neural signature of altruistic punishment. It was, he believed, the satisfaction of seeing justice done. But lately, something was wrong. The world outside his lab was changing, or maybe it was always this way, and he was only now seeing it clearly. It started with a newspaper article a colleague sent him. The headline read, "Rich less empathetic than poor, study says." He read the research. The data was solid. People in positions of power, people with wealth and status, they were worse at reading emotions. They were less likely to be altruistic. More likely to be selfish. It was a strange paradox. People often gained power through empathy and collaboration, but once they had it, those very traits began to fade. And then, he started reading about something called the normalization of deviance. A sociologist named Diane Vaughan had coined the term. It described a quiet, creeping process. Imagine a safety rule being ignored. No one gets hurt. So the rule is ignored again. Still no consequences. Over time, the unsafe behavior becomes normal. It becomes the way things are done. Until, one day, there is a catastrophe. And everyone looks back and asks, how did we let this happen? Aries saw this pattern everywhere he looked. In the concentration of wealth. In the removal of consequence for the powerful. In the capture of politics. In the manufacture of desperation. And finally, the normalization of it all. His unease grew into something darker after he read another study. This one was called The Pleasure of Revenge. Where Aries had seen the dorsal striatum as the seat of justice, this new research pointed to a different region, the nucleus accumbens. A more primal reward center. And here's what they found: provocation didn't just make people angry. It made aggression feel good. The brain tipped toward reward. And people with the strongest activation in this region, they had histories of real-world violence. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about the sheer, hedonic pleasure of inflicting pain. Aries stared at the brain scans on his monitor, hot spots of orange and red glowing in the reward circuitry, and he thought of another file on his desk. A study about online petitions. Moral outrage, it said, was the engine of virality. It spread like wildfire. But here was the twist: outrage did not translate into signatures. It didn't translate into the actual, effortful work of change. Outrage was a narcotic. It felt good to share. But it was hollow. Meanwhile, the things that actually made a difference, agency, group identity, prosociality, they went quiet, unsensationalized by the algorithms that fed on anger. Aries felt a familiar frustration rising in his chest. Was this all his life's work had led to? An atlas of the brain's most self-destructive impulses? That afternoon, his old mentor, a retired professor named Ilara, came to visit. She found him surrounded by printouts, his face etched with weariness. "You look like a man who's discovered his life's work is a manual for a machine that's gone haywire," she said. Aries pushed a paper across the desk. "I'm not sure it's haywire," he said. "I think it's working exactly as designed." Ilara picked it up. It was a summary of studies on economic students and cooperation. "They learn that self-interest is rational," Aries said. "We teach them a cynical view of human nature. Put them in a prisoner's dilemma, and they defect. We don't just study selfishness, Ilara. We cultivate it." He handed her another page. A quote from the science fiction writer Frank Herbert, underlined in red ink. "It is not that power corrupts," Herbert wrote, "but that it is magnetic to the corruptible." This is the heart of it, Aries said. We have built a system, political, economic, social, that selects for people with an overactive reward response to dominance and a muted response to empathy. We create structures where the normalization of deviance is the path of least resistance. And then we act shocked when it all collapses. Ilara was quiet for a long moment. She flipped through the pages until she stopped at a quote from Dostoevsky. "Nothing is easier than to denounce the Evildor," she read aloud. "Nothing more difficult than understanding him." She looked up. "So what's your move, Ares? Do you keep mapping the pleasure of revenge? Or do you try to understand the system that makes that pleasure the default?" He shook his head slowly. "My models are too small. I can see the signal, but I've been ignoring the noise of the system that creates it." He pulled out one last page. This one was about Norwegian prisons. He read the warden's words aloud: "Treat people like dirt, and they'll be dirt. Treat them like human beings, and they'll act like human beings. A society is judged by how it treats its criminals," Ilara said softly, recalling another Dostoevsky line. "Right," Ares said, a new energy in his voice. "Norway has a 20% recidivism rate. We have 60%. They treat the goal as rehabilitation. We treat it as punishment. One system understands the human mind. The other just feeds the pleasure of retribution." He stood up, pacing now. The research showed that self-regulatory processes in the brain, in the lateral prefrontal cortex, can keep aggressive urges at bay. That's the brake. But our system, the one that rewards outrage, concentrates wealth, and removes consequences, it is systematically disabling that brake. It's not that people are innately corrupt. It's that we've built a world that selects for and amplifies the most corruptible among us. He turned to face Ilara. "I can't just study the signal in the scanner anymore. I have to study the system that creates the noise. My next paper isn't going to be about the dorsal striatum. It's going to be about the structural conditions that let the normalization of deviance take hold. Because if we don't understand the system, we're just treating the symptoms, while the disease itself continues to spread." Ilara smiled. "So, from neuroeconomics to systemic analysis. A big step." Ares looked back at the glowing brain scans on his monitor. He saw them differently now. Not as the whole story, but as a single, vital piece of a much larger puzzle. "No," he said quietly. "It's the only logical next step. We have the data on what the brain does. Now we have to understand the environment we've built that tells it, this is the way to be."